The first tremor wasn't in the earth, but in the frantic cadence of the dispatcher's voice, a thin wire of panic stretched taut over the usual drone of city emergencies. Elias, his hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic and the metallic tang of old blood from the morning's overdose call, pressed the receiver tighter to his ear. Static. Then, Unit 12. Multiple casualties. City center. Unknown. Unknown aggressor. Reports of extreme violence. All available units respond. Extreme violence. In a city that had seen its share of horrors, that phrase still managed to curdle the stale coffee in his stomach. He glanced at his partner, Martinez, young, barely out of training, face pale under the fluorescent lights of the station. Elias just nodded, a grin set to his jaw. Another day in hell, he thought, not knowing how literal that sentiment was about to become. The siren's wail split the morning air, a familiar scream that usually faded into the urban cacophony. Today, it felt different, more urgent, a premonition. The streets were already a snarl of confusion. Cars abandoned mid-lane, doors ajar, people running, not with the directed panic of a fire drill, but with a wild, unfocused terror, their faces masks of disbelief. He saw a woman stumble, fall, and not get up, a dark stain blooming on the sidewalk beneath her. No one stopped to help. Elias gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't a gang war. This was something else. Something primal. The radio crackled again, this time a choked scream before it cut to dead air. Martinez was muttering prayers, his crucifix clutched tight. Elias felt a cold knot in his gut, the kind that came before the real bad calls, the ones that stuck with you replaying in the dark hours. But this was a new kind of cold, a premonition of a world unhinged. They were 2 blocks from the city center when they saw the first one. A man, or what had once been a man, in a torn business suit, was hunched over a prone figure, tearing at it with a savage intensity. His movements were jerky, unnatural, his head lolling at an impossible angle. When he looked up, his eyes were milky white, devoid of reason, and his mouth was a rictus of blood and gore. He let out a guttural snarl, a sound that vibrated deep in Elias's bones, and lunged at a nearby pedestrian. Elias slammed on the brakes, the ambulance skidding. "Holy Mother of God," Martinez whispered, his voice cracking. Elias didn't have time for theology. He saw it now, the pattern in the chaos. The milky eyes, the bloodied mouths, the relentless animalistic aggression. This wasn't just violence, it was a contagion of madness. His paramedic training screamed at him, secure the scene, assess the casualties. But the scene was the entire goddamn city, and the casualties were becoming the aggressors. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through his professional conditioning. Survive. He threw the ambulance into reverse, tires screeching, narrowly avoiding another of those things as it slammed against the driver's side window, a bloody handprint smearing across the glass. He had to get out, not just of this street, but of the city. The thought of his small apartment, the unpaid bills, the lingering ghost of his dead wife, Sarah. It all felt like a distant, irrelevant dream. The only reality was the tightening noose of this unfolding nightmare. He needed supplies, a weapon, a plan. He needed to live. For Sarah, maybe. Or maybe just because the alternative, becoming one of those things, was too horrific to contemplate. The memory of her face, pale and still in the hospital bed, flashed before his eyes. He'd failed to save her then. He wouldn't fail himself now. He had to find a defensible place, somewhere to regroup, to think. His old precinct, maybe, the one downtown before he transferred. It had reinforced walls, limited access. But getting there. He navigated the increasingly chaotic streets, each block a fresh tableau of horror. The things were everywhere, swarming, their numbers growing with a terrifying speed. He saw a young girl, no older than 10, cornered in an alley, her screams swallowed by the snarls of 2 advancing figures. Elias's foot twitched towards the accelerator, then recoiled. He couldn't. He was one man, one ambulance. To stop was to die. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, but the instinct to survive was a sharper, more insistent goad. He drove on, the girl's screams echoing in his mind, another ghost to add to his collection. He had to make choices, brutal ones. The city was a death trap, a charnel house in the making. His only hope was to get to the edge, to find a way out, but even that seemed like a fool's errand. Where would he go? What lay beyond the city limits? Was this madness contained, or was the whole world descending into this bloody abyss? He didn't know. He only knew the gnawing fear, the desperate thrum of his own heart, and the chilling certainty that the world he knew had ended sometime between his morning coffee and the dispatcher's frantic call. This was day one of a new, terrible calendar, and the sun, climbing higher in the sky, seemed to mock the darkness unfolding below, its light indifferent to the horrors it illuminated. The city's heart was no longer beating with life, but with the frantic, twitching pulse of the newly damned. He had to keep moving, keep thinking, keep breathing. The alternative was unthinkable. He saw a flicker of movement in his rearview mirror, not an infected, but a figure darting between cars, small, agile. A kid, alone. For a split second their eyes met through the grimy glass. Desperation, the same raw terror he felt in his own gut. He hesitated, the image of the girl in the alley flashing again. This time, the calculation felt different. Maybe. The city was a symphony of screams, a canvas of crimson. Elias swerved the ambulance down a side street, narrower, choked with debris but momentarily clearer of the shambling, snarling infected. The kid he'd seen, the one with the desperate eyes, was scrambling over a pile of overflowing bins at the alley's end. A lone figure, maybe 13, 14, wiry, clutching a backpack. Lena. He didn't know her name then, of course. She was just another flicker of humanity in a world rapidly losing its claim to the word. He honked, a short, sharp blast. The figure froze, then spun, eyes wide with a fear that was achingly familiar. Two infected were lumbering into the alley behind her, their movements unnervingly purposeful. Elias slammed the passenger door open with his elbow, leaning across the seat. "Get in, now!" His voice was a harsh rasp, stripped of bedside manner. No time for pleasantries. The girl, Lena, didn't hesitate. She launched herself from the bins, a surprisingly agile leap, and dove into the ambulance, landing in a heap on the passenger seat just as Elias stomped on the accelerator. A grotesque, milky-eyed face slammed against the window where she'd been moments before, its teeth clacking against the glass. Lena scrambled upright, breathing hard, her gaze fixed on the receding horror. "Thanks," she gasped, her voice thin, reedy. "Don't thank me yet," Elias grunted, wrenching the wheel to avoid a stalled bus. "We're not out of this." He glanced at her, scratched, dirty, but her eyes held a spark, a flicker of something that wasn't just terror. Resilience, maybe, or just the stunned disbelief of a survivor. "What's your name?" "Lena." "Elias." An introduction in hell seemed appropriate. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Good question. The vague notion of out wasn't much of a plan. His old precinct was miles away, across the most heavily infected part of the city, suicidal. Somewhere defensible, somewhere to think. He remembered a supply depot on the industrial outskirts, near the river. Fenced, solid buildings. Not ideal, but better than this open slaughterhouse. "There's a depot, west side by the Kellerman Bridge. Might be quieter. Might be, or it might be a fresh circle of hell. Every choice now was a gamble, a blind step into the dark." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the streets, a silent partner in their desperate flight. She pointed. "Look out!" An infected, dressed in a mailman's uniform, its satchel spilling letters onto the blood-slicked pavement, lunged from between two parked cars. Elias swerved, the ambulance's side panel scraping against a brick wall with a shriek of tortured metal. The impact threw them both against their seatbelts. The infected bounced off, fell, and began to twitch its way back up. They didn't stop. They couldn't. The afternoon wore on, a blur of near misses, grotesque sights, and the constant thrumming soundtrack of citywide panic. The infected were evolving, or so it seemed. Some were faster, more agile. Others moved in small, unnerving packs. The city was transforming before their eyes, devolving into a hunting ground. Each street they cleared felt like a small victory. Each avoided confrontation a borrowed moment of life. Lena proved to be a good spotter, her young eyes sharp, her warnings quick. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just watched, her face a grim, pale mask. Elias wondered about her family, her story, but the questions died on his lips. There was no room for pasts now, only the brutal, demanding present. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the smoke-choked sky, they neared the industrial district. Fewer infected here, but the silence was almost more unnerving. The distant screams were replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the rumble of their ambulance and the occasional, unsettling skittering sound from a darkened warehouse. The Kellerman Bridge loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the dying light. "The depot's just past that," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "We'll see if we can get in, find some supplies, hole up for the night." Lena just nodded, her gaze fixed on the bridge. It looked too quiet, too still. A trap. Elias felt it too, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. But what choice did they have? To stay in the open was a death sentence. To turn back was to re-enter the inferno. They drove onto the bridge, the tires humming on the metal grating. Halfway across, Elias saw it, a makeshift barricade of wrecked cars and debris completely blocking the far end, and figures moving behind it. Not infected. Humans. Armed. Elias's heart sank. This wasn't a refuge. This was a gauntlet. He had a split second to decide. Break and be a sitting duck? Or try to ram through? Before he could choose, a glint of light from the barricade, a rifle scope, and then the crack of a gunshot. The windshield exploded inwards, showering them with glass. Lena screamed, a raw, terrified sound that cut through Elias like a knife. He ducked instinctively, wrenching the wheel hard to the left. The ambulance careened, tires screeching, and slammed into the bridge's railing with a bone-jarring crash. Darkness. Then, pain, a searing agony in his shoulder. The world swam back into focus, a dizzying, fragmented mess. Lena was moaning beside him, clutching her arm. Gunfire, more shots whizzing past, thudding into the ambulance's frame. They were pinned. Day one, and already it felt like the end. The descent had been terrifyingly swift. The ringing in Elias's ears was a high, keening shriek, almost drowning out the sporadic crack of gunfire from the barricade. His left shoulder throbbed with a deep, fiery pain, and he could feel warm blood soaking his shirt. Lena was slumped against the door, her face contorted, one hand clamped over her right bicep. "You hit?" he managed, his voice a gravelly whisper. She nodded, a single jerky movement, her eyes wide and glassy. "Arm. I think it's broken." Damn it. Trapped on a bridge, one of them wounded, with armed hostiles ahead and a city of infected horrors behind. The options were narrowing to zero at an alarming rate. He risked a glance over the dashboard. The barricade was about 50 yards away. Figures were moving, taking aim. He couldn't stay here. The ambulance, once a symbol of help, was now a steel coffin. "We have to move," he hissed, fumbling for the door handle with his good hand. "Can you run?" Lena gritted her teeth, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on her forehead. I think so." Another shot pinged off the roof. They were toying with them, or just bad shots. Elias didn't want to wait to find out which. "Okay, on three. We go back. Towards the city side. Use the ambulance for cover as long as we can, then make a break for the access ladder." He'd spotted it earlier, a rusted iron ladder leading down from the bridge to the riverbank below. A long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "Ladder?" Lena's voice was faint. "Trust me." He didn't trust himself, but what else could he say? 1, 2, 3. He shoved his door open, the twisted metal groaning in protest, and rolled out, hitting the cold, grimy surface of the bridge. Pain lanced through his shoulder, and for a moment, the world grayed at the edges. He pushed it back, crawling, using the bulk of the ambulance as a shield. Lena was slower, hampered by her arm, but she was moving, her face a mask of determined agony. Bullets whined overhead, closer now. They knew. He reached the rear of the ambulance, risked a look. The ladder was still 20 feet away, a terrifyingly open stretch. "Now, Lena, run!" He pushed himself up, his wounded shoulder screaming, and sprinted, his good arm pumping, the other held tight against his chest. Lena was beside him, a small, desperate shadow, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The air split with the sound of impacts around them, concrete chips flying. They were almost there. 5 more feet. He could see the rusted rungs. He reached it, grabbing a rung with his good hand, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the slick metal. "You first," he yelled at Lena, trying to shield her with his body. She hesitated. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, she swung herself onto the ladder, her injured arm dangling uselessly, her good hand and legs working with desperate speed. Elias started down after her, the jarring movement sending fresh waves of agony through his shoulder. He glanced up. A figure was leaning over the bridge railing, aiming a rifle. No time. He let go, dropping the last 10 feet, hitting the muddy riverbank with a jarring thud that knocked the breath from his lungs. Lena landed beside him a second later, a pained cry escaping her lips. They lay there for a moment, gasping, the sounds of the bridge fading above them, replaced by the gentle lapping of the river and the distant, ever-present chorus of the city's damned. The sun had almost set, casting long, grotesque shadows. Elias pushed himself up, his body protesting every movement. Lena was cradling her arm, tears silently tracing paths down her dirty cheeks. "We made it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Made it where? To a new level of hell, perhaps. The riverbank was a desolate stretch of mud and reeds, offering little cover. The city loomed behind them, a dark, silent beast. The immediate threat from the bridge seemed to have receded, but they weren't safe, not by a long shot. He had to find shelter, tend to their wounds. His shoulder was on fire. He ripped away the tattered remains of his shirt. A nasty gash, bleeding freely. Not a direct hit, thank God. More like shrapnel from the windshield or a ricochet. Lena's arm looked bad, swollen and unnaturally angled. Definitely broken. He was a paramedic, but his kit was in the ambulance, on the bridge, 1,000,000 miles away. He had nothing. "We need to find something," he said, his voice strained. "Cloth for bandages, clean water." He scanned the bleak landscape. A derelict pumping station stood a few hundred yards downriver, its windows dark and broken, like empty eye sockets. It was their only option. The walk was a nightmare. Every step was an effort. Elias's shoulder throbbed relentlessly, and Lena was clearly in immense pain, but she didn't complain, just stumbled along beside him, her small face set in a grimace. The silence of the riverbank was broken by a new sound, a wet, shuffling noise from the reeds ahead. Elias froze, his hand instinctively going to his hip, where his sidearm usually rested. It wasn't there. He'd lost it in the crash, or hadn't even had time to grab it from the station. He was unarmed. Lena tensed beside him, her good hand clenching into a fist. The shuffling grew closer. Then, a figure emerged from the reeds. Infected, bloated, its clothes in tatters, its milky eyes fixing on them with a horrifying, vacant stare. It let out a low, gurgling moan and began to shamble towards them, its movements slow but inexorable. Behind it, another appeared, then a third. They were cut off. Elias's mind raced. No weapon, wounded. Lena even more so. This was it. This was how it ended. Day 1, and they hadn't even made it to nightfall. The 3 infected advanced, their gurgling moans a grotesque chorus in the fading twilight. Elias shoved Lena behind him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had to do something, anything. His eyes darted around, searching for a weapon, a stone, a sturdy piece of driftwood, Anything. He spotted a length of rusted pipe lying half buried in the mud a few feet away. Not much, but better than his bare hands. He lunged for it, pain shooting through his shoulder as he stooped, his fingers closing around the cold, rough metal. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it felt like a lifeline. The closest infected was almost upon them, its putrid breath washing over Elias in a wave of nausea. He swung the pipe, a desperate, clumsy arc, connecting with the side of the creature's head with a sickening thud. It staggered, a dark fluid oozing from the impact site, but it didn't go down. It just snarled, a deeper, angrier sound, and lunged again. Elias stumbled back, swinging the pipe wildly. He needed space, needed to protect Lena. He caught a glimpse of her, her face ashen, her good hand clutching a jagged rock she must have found. She was a fighter, this kid. The thought gave him a sliver of strength. He focused on the first infected, bringing the pipe down with all his might on its lolling head. This time, there was a crack, a sound like dry wood splitting, and the creature crumpled, its limbs twitching. One down. 2 to go. The other 2 were closing in, their movements quicker now, as if their companion's demise had agitated them. Elias backed away, trying to keep them both in front of him, the pipe a clumsy extension of his will. He feinted at one, then swung at the other. But they were too close, their grasping, bloodied hands reaching for him. One of them snagged his wounded arm. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot explosion that almost made him black out. He roared, a sound of pure agony and rage, and twisted, yanking his arm free, tearing his flesh further. Lena screamed, a high, piercing sound, and threw her rock. It struck one of the infected on the side of its head, making it stumble, momentarily distracted. It was the opening Elias needed. He lunged, ramming the end of the pipe into the creature's chest. It gurgled, a horrifying liquid sound, and fell backward, clawing at its torso. The third one was on him, its teeth snapping inches from his face. He could smell its rotten flesh, see the vacant hunger in its milky eyes. He grappled with it, the pipe useless at such close quarters. They crashed to the muddy ground, Elias on his back, the infected's weight pressing down on him, its fetid saliva dripping onto his cheek. He thrashed, trying to dislodge it, his good hand scrabbling for purchase, his legs kicking. Its jaws descended. He closed his eyes, a wave of despair washing over him. Then, a grunt, and the weight on his chest lessened. He opened his eyes. Lena was there, straddling the infected's back, her small hands wrapped around the pipe he'd dropped, bringing it down again and again on the creature's skull with a savage, desperate fury. Each thud was punctuated by her ragged breaths. Finally, the infected went still. Lena rolled off it, her chest heaving, the pipe clattering from her trembling grasp. She stared at the 3 crumpled forms, her face a mixture of horror, shock, and a strange, dawning awareness. She'd killed. Elias pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He looked at Lena, truly looked at her. She was just a kid, but she'd saved his life. Twice now, in a way. "You okay?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer, just stared at the dead infected, her eyes wide and haunted. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. The look of someone who'd crossed a line, who'd seen too much, done too much. The pumping station was a dark, looming silhouette now. They had to get there. He offered Lena his good hand. She took it, her small, trembling fingers gripping his with surprising strength. Together, they stumbled towards the derelict building, leaving the carnage behind them, the silence of the riverbank once again broken only by the lapping water and the distant, mournful cries of the dying city. Day 2 had begun, not with a sunrise, but with the chilling understanding that survival would demand more than they ever thought they had to give. The descent was far from over, it was only just beginning, and as they reached the rusted, groaning door of the pumping station, a new sound joined the night symphony, a low, rhythmic scraping coming from within. They weren't alone. The scraping sound from within the pumping station sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Elias's exhausted body. He pushed Lena gently behind him, his grip tightening on the bloodied pipe. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find somewhere, anywhere else. But where? The riverbank was a death trap, the city a charnel house. This dilapidated building, as ominous as it felt, was their only chance for shelter, for a moment to catch their breath and tend to their wounds. He pressed his ear to the cold, rusted metal of the door. The scraping was irregular, followed by a soft, dragging noise. Not the frenetic movements of the infected. Something else. Human? Or some new horror the dying world had conjured? He took a deep breath, trying to quell the tremor in his hands. "Stay here," he whispered to Lena, his voice barely audible above the thumping of his own heart. "If I'm not back in 2 minutes or if you hear anything, run. Don't look back." Lena's eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, met his. She nodded, a small, terrified jerk of her head. He could see the raw fear in her, but also that spark of resilience, the stubborn refusal to break that he was beginning to admire and rely on. He tested the door. It was stuck, rusted shut. He put his good shoulder to it, gritting his teeth against the searing pain, and pushed. The metal groaned, a sound like a dying beast, then gave way with a shriek, the door swinging inwards into pitch blackness. A gust of stale, fetid air washed over him, thick with the smell of damp concrete, rust, and something else. Something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. The scraping sound stopped. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. Elias stepped inside, the pipe held ready, his eyes straining to adjust to the oppressive darkness. Moonlight, filtering through a grime-covered window high on one wall, cast long, distorted shadows, turning familiar shapes into lurking monsters. The pumping station was a cavernous space, filled with the hulking, silent machinery of a forgotten era. Catwalks crisscrossed overhead, disappearing into the gloom. And in the center of the room, a faint, flickering light. A candle. He moved towards it, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast space. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential threat. As he drew closer, the source of the scraping became clear. A figure was hunched over a makeshift workbench, a small wizened man, his back to Elias, meticulously sharpening a long, wicked-looking blade on a whetstone. The dragging sound must have been the stone. The man wore patched, dirty clothes, and his hair was a matted, gray mess. He seemed oblivious to Elias's presence, completely absorbed in his task. Elias cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The man froze. Slowly, almost painfully, he turned. His face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was a roadmap of hardship, etched with deep lines and shadowed by suspicion. His eyes, small and dark, darted towards Elias, then to the pipe in his hand. They were like the eyes of a cornered animal, wary and dangerous. "Who are you?" the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across concrete. "What do you want?" "We're looking for shelter," Elias said, trying to keep his tone even, non-threatening. My daughter is wounded." It was a lie, but daughter felt safer than kid I just met. "The city, it's gone mad." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Daughter, you say?" He gestured with the knife towards the open doorway. "She out there?" "Yes. We need a place for the night, just until morning." The old man considered him for a long moment, his gaze unblinking. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he set the knife down on the workbench. "Bring her in. But no trouble. I've had enough trouble for a lifetime." Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over Elias. He nodded, backing slowly towards the door. "No trouble. I promise." He found Lena huddled where he'd left her, her face pale, her good hand still clutching the jagged rock. "It's okay," he said, offering a hand. "There's someone inside, an old man. He says we can stay." Lena looked past him, towards the dark maw of the pumping station, her eyes filled with doubt, but she took his hand, and together they stepped into the flickering candlelight. The old man, whose name they learned was Samuel, was as good as his word, in his own gruff way. He offered them a corner of the vast room, a dusty blanket, and a cup of murky water from a rain barrel. He didn't ask many questions, and Elias didn't offer many answers. The unspoken truth of the world outside was a shared, grim understanding. Samuel helped Elias clean and crudely bandage his shoulder with strips of cloth he tore from an old shirt. For Lena's arm, he fashioned a makeshift splint from pieces of wood and more cloth, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he'd wrestled demons. As he worked, he muttered about the fever, the madness, how it had come on so fast, how the city had eaten itself. He'd been here, in his pumping station for years, a forgotten relic of a dying infrastructure. He'd seen the decay, but nothing like this. Night settled, and with it, a fragile, exhausted truce. Elias and Lena lay huddled under the thin blanket, the pain in their wounds a constant, throbbing reminder of the day's horrors. Samuel sat by his workbench, the knife once again in his hands, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal a strangely comforting sound in the oppressive silence. Sleep was a distant, impossible dream. Elias's mind replayed the day's events, the screams, the blood, the milky vacant eyes of the infected. He thought of Lena, of the burden he'd taken on, or that had been thrust upon him. He thought of Sarah, of the promises he'd made and broken. The world had become a brutal, unforgiving place, and he was just a man, wounded and weary, with a kid to protect. How long could they last? The scraping stopped. Samuel was looking at them, his dark eyes glinting in the candlelight. "You get some sleep," he rasped. Tomorrow you'll need your strength." Elias doubted tomorrow would be any kinder than today. But for now, in this dusty, forgotten corner of a dying world, with the rhythmic scrape of a knife as their lullaby, they were, for a fleeting, precious moment, safe. It was a lie, of course. Safety was an illusion, but sometimes an illusion was all you had to cling to. The pre-dawn light was a pale, sickly gray, seeping through the grime-caked windows of the pumping station, painting the hulking machinery in ghostly hues. Elias awoke with a start, his body stiff and aching, his shoulder a symphony of pain. The rhythmic scraping of Samuel's knife had stopped. For a moment panic seized him. Had the old man left? Or worse? Then he saw him, a still, dark shape slumped over the workbench, his head resting on his arms, asleep. Or so Elias hoped. Lena was still asleep beside him, her breathing shallow, her face pale but peaceful in the dim light. Her splinted arm lay awkwardly across her chest. Guilt gnawed at Elias. He'd dragged this kid into his desperate flight, and now she was wounded, traumatized, her childhood shattered. He had to get her somewhere truly safe, but the very concept of safety seemed to have evaporated from the world. He eased himself up, gritting his teeth against the protest of his shoulder. He needed to check their surroundings, see what day 3 had in store. He moved silently towards the rusted door, peering through a crack. The riverbank was shrouded in mist, the air cold and damp. Nothing moved. The silence was heavy, unnatural. He remembered the previous night, the infected, the desperate fight. They'd been lucky. Luck, he knew, was a fickle, finite resource. He needed a plan, a real one. The industrial district was a maze of warehouses and factories. Some might offer better shelter, more supplies. But they were also potential death traps, filled with who knew what horrors. His primary concern was Lena's arm. It needed proper medical attention, or infection would set in. He was a paramedic, but without his kit, without antibiotics, his skills were severely limited. There had been a small clinic in the old Milltown district, a few miles upriver. A long shot, but it was the only option he could think of. Samuel stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. He pushed himself upright, his eyes blinking in the dim light. He looked at Elias, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Morning," he rasped, his voice still thick with sleep. "Or what's left of it." "Morning," Elias replied. "We need to move. My daughter's arm needs looking at." Samuel grunted, running a hand over his matted hair. "Ain't no doctors left, son. Just the dead and the dying. There was a clinic, Milltown. Might find supplies." Samuel considered this, his eyes scanning Elias, then Lena's sleeping form. Milltown's a bad place now, was bad before. Worse now, I reckon. We don't have many choices. No, Samuel agreed, a hint of resignation in his voice. No, I suppose we don't. He rose, stretching his creaky limbs. I got a little food. Dried meat. Not much, but it's something. The offer, as meager as it was, touched Elias. In this new world, kindness was a rarer commodity than gold. While Samuel rummaged through a battered tin box, producing a few strips of dark, leathery jerky, Lena began to stir. She woke with a small, frightened gasp, her eyes darting around before settling on Elias. The fear in them was a fresh stab to his conscience. They ate in silence, the jerky tough and salty, but it was sustenance. Elias watched Lena. She ate slowly, mechanically, her gaze distant. The trauma of the past 2 days was etched on her young face. He had to get her through this. He owed her that much. As they prepared to leave, Samuel pressed something into Elias's hand. A small, heavy wrench. Ain't much, the old man said. But it's better than that pipe. Swings truer. Elias gripped the wrench. It felt solid, balanced. Thank you, Samuel. The old man just grunted. You watch yourselves out there. The world's gone hungry. They stepped out into the misty morning, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The pumping station, their temporary refuge, already felt like a distant memory. Milltown was their goal. Elias tried to ignore the gnawing uncertainty, the fear that it would be another dead end, another circle of hell. He focused on Lena, on her small, determined steps beside him. He had to be strong for her. He had to find a way. The journey upriver was a tense, nerve-wracking trek. They stuck to the riverbank, using the reeds and overgrown vegetation for cover. The mist, while unnerving, also provided a degree of concealment. Several times they heard the telltale shuffling and gurgling of infected nearby, forcing them to freeze, hearts pounding, until the sounds receded. Each encounter frayed Elias's nerves further. Lena, despite her injury, moved with a quiet resilience that continued to surprise him. She didn't speak much, but her eyes were constantly scanning, alert to any sign of danger. They passed derelict factories, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the ruined world. Rusted barges lay half-sunk in the murky river, their decks tilted at grotesque angles. The only signs of life were the carrion birds circling overhead, their dark wings a constant reminder of the pervasive death. After what felt like an eternity, the skeletal frame of a railway bridge came into view, its rusted girders spanning the river. Milltown's just on the other side of that, Elias said, his voice little more than a whisper. The bridge looked old, unstable, but it was their only way across. As they approached, a low growl echoed from beneath the bridge. Elias froze, pushing Lena back. Figures emerged from the shadows under the bridge. Not infected. Humans. 4 of them. Gaunt, ragged, their eyes burning with a desperate predatory light. They carried makeshift weapons, sharpened pieces of metal, heavy clubs. They spread out, blocking the path to the bridge. One of them, a tall skeletal man with a matted beard and a cruel slash of a mouth, stepped forward, a rusted machete held loosely in his hand. Well, well, he rasped, a predatory grin spreading across his face. What have we here? Looks like a couple of lost lambs. Elias's hand tightened on the wrench. This was bad, very bad. These weren't just survivors. These were jackals preying on the weak, and he and Lena, wounded and exhausted, were the weakest of prey. The tall, skeletal man with the machete took another step closer, his predatory grin widening, his eyes, like chips of dirty ice, raking over Elias and Lena. The other 3 fanned out, their movements a practiced, menacing dance. Elias's mind raced. He could try to fight, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. His shoulder throbbed, a dull, insistent ache. Lena was in no condition for a struggle. Running was an option, but where? Back towards the city of infected, or into the unknown, equally dangerous wilderness? Just passing through, Elias said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in his gut. "We don't want any trouble." The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Trouble? Oh, we ain't looking for trouble, friend. We're just looking for contributions. To the local survival fund, you might say." His gaze lingered on Lena, on the backpack Elias carried, which held only Samuel's meager offering of jerky and a few strips of cloth. "You got food in that bag? Medicine, maybe?" Elias shifted, trying to subtly position himself further in front of Lena. "Not much. We're in a bad way ourselves." "Ain't we all?" the man sneered. "But some of us are better at finding what we need than others." He gestured with the machete. "Let's just have a look in that bag, and maybe the girl's got something valuable. Young things like her, they always got something hidden away." Lena flinched, pressing closer to Elias. The man's words were a vile insinuation, a threat that made Elias's blood run cold. Anger, hot and fierce, surged through him, momentarily eclipsing the fear. He wouldn't let them touch her, not while he was still breathing. He tightened his grip on the wrench, its cold metal a small, inadequate comfort. "You're not touching her," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you're not getting the bag." The man's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold, murderous intent. "Brave words, old man. Stupid, but brave," he signaled to his companions. "Looks like we'll have to persuade them." Two of them moved towards Elias, their makeshift weapons raised. The third circled around, trying to get at Lena. Elias tensed, ready to swing, ready to sell his life dearly. But before he could move, a blur of motion erupted from his side. Lena. She launched herself at the man circling towards her, her good hand, still clutching the jagged rock she'd found the day before, slamming into the side of his head with surprising force. The man roared in pain and surprise, staggering back, his hand flying to his temple. Lena didn't hesitate. She kicked out, her small boot connecting with his shin, and he howled again, dropping his club. It was a desperate, reckless move, but it bought them a precious second. Elias seized the opening. He lunged at the closest of the two men advancing on him, swinging the heavy wrench in a wide, desperate arc. The man tried to parry with his sharpened piece of metal, but the wrench, crude as it was, had weight and momentum. It crashed against his weapon, sending a jarring shock up Elias's arm, then connected with the man's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, dropping his weapon, his arm hanging limp. Elias didn't pause. He spun, bringing the wrench around in a backhand swing, aiming for the second attacker. But this one was quicker, more agile. He dodged the blow, his own weapon, a heavy iron bar, whistling past Elias's head, inches from his skull. The tall man with the machete was advancing again, his face a mask of fury. Lena was grappling with the man she'd attacked, a desperate, tangled struggle. They were still outnumbered, still in a losing fight. Elias dodged another swing from the man with the iron bar, the wind of its passage cold on his cheek. He was tiring, his wounded shoulder a constant, agonizing distraction. He had to end this, and fast. He feinted with the wrench. Then, as the man committed to a parry, Elias dropped low, sweeping his leg out in a desperate, unorthodox move. The man, caught off balance, stumbled, his arms flailing. Elias surged up, bringing the wrench down on the man's exposed head. A sickening crack, and the man crumpled, his iron bar clattering on the rocky ground. 2 down. But the tall man was almost on him, the machete whistling through the air. Elias barely managed to raise the wrench in time to block the blow. The impact was bone-jarring, sending splinters of pain through his already injured shoulder. The machete bit into the metal of the wrench, lodging there. For a heart-stopping moment, they were locked, straining against each other, their faces inches apart. Elias is a mask of desperate effort, the tall man's a snarl of murderous rage. He could smell the man's foul breath, see the yellowed, broken teeth. Then, with a roar, Elias twisted, using the leverage of the embedded machete, and wrenched it from the man's grasp. The tall man, disarmed and momentarily surprised, stumbled back. Elias didn't give him a chance to recover. He lunged, swinging the wrench again, aiming for the man's head. But the man was surprisingly quick. He ducked, and the wrench whistled over his head. He came up fast, a nasty-looking hunting knife appearing in his hand, as if from nowhere. He lunged at Elias, the blade aimed at his gut. Elias twisted, the knife slicing through his tattered shirt, drawing a thin line of fire across his ribs. He grunted in pain, but there was no time to react. The man was on him, the knife raised for another strike. Suddenly, a small dark shape hurtled through the air. Lena's rock. It struck the tall man on the side of his head, not hard enough to fell him, but enough to make him grunt and momentarily lose focus. Elias seized the opening. He brought the wrench down with every ounce of strength he had left, connecting squarely with the man's exposed temple. A sickening thud, and the tall man's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut, the knife clattering beside him. Silence, broken only by their ragged, desperate gasps for air. Elias leaned on the wrench, his chest heaving, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Lena stood a few feet away, her small frame shaking, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, almost feral light. They'd done it. They'd survived. Again. But the cost was mounting. Elias looked at the bodies on the ground. 3 men, dead or dying, because of them. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold, sick dread. This world was forcing them to become monsters just to stay alive. How much more could they take before they became indistinguishable from the things they fought? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. Day 3. And the sun, finally breaking through the morning mist, seemed to illuminate a world steeped in blood and violence. A world where innocence was a forgotten dream, and survival was a brutal, daily war. The descent continued, relentless and unforgiving. The silence that descended after the brutal, desperate fight was heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant, mournful cry of a river bird. Elias leaned heavily on the wrench, his body a symphony of aches and pains, his wounded shoulder a throbbing inferno. His ribs, where the knife had grazed him, burned with a stinging fire. He looked at Lena. She was staring at the crumpled form of the tall man, her face pale, her eyes wide and haunted. The jagged rock, stained with blood, had fallen from her trembling hand. She had once again saved his life, or at least given him the opening he needed. This kid. She was made of something tougher than he could have imagined. He pushed himself upright, wincing. "We need to go," he said, his voice hoarse, "before more of them show up, or worse." He didn't need to elaborate. The thought of the infected, drawn by the sounds of their struggle, was a cold knot in his stomach. Lena nodded, her gaze still fixed on the dead man. She looked like she was about to be sick. Elias knew the feeling. The aftermath of violence was often worse than the violence itself. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a hollow, sickening emptiness. He retrieved the machete from where it had fallen. It was a brutal, ugly weapon, but it was better than his wrench. He also picked up the hunting knife. Weapons. In this new world, they were as essential as food and water. He offered the knife to Lena. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a grim, dawning understanding. She took it, her small hand closing around the worn handle. It looked too big for her, too menacing. But he knew she would use it if she had to. She already had. He quickly searched the bodies of their attackers. They had little of value, a few more strips of jerky, a half-empty canteen of foul-smelling water, a handful of scavenged odds and ends. He took the jerky and the canteen, leaving the rest. He didn't want their tainted possessions. He just wanted to get away from this place, this monument to their brutal survival. The railway bridge loomed ahead, its rusted girders a skeletal arch against the pale morning sky. It was still their only way to Milltown, to the faint, desperate hope of finding medical supplies. But crossing it now felt even more dangerous than before. What if there were more of them, waiting on the other side? He scanned the far bank, but saw no sign of movement. It was a risk they had to take. "Stay close," he told Lena, his voice a low, urgent whisper. They moved towards the bridge, their steps slow and cautious, their eyes darting nervously around. The silence of the riverbank felt ominous, pregnant with unseen threats. Each rustle of reeds, Each splash of water sent a jolt of fear through Elias. They reached the bridge, its metal grating cold and slick under their feet. The wind whistled through the girders, a mournful, eerie sound. Elias went first, the machete held ready, his senses on high alert. Lena followed, her small bandaged figure a shadow at his heels, the hunting knife clutched tight in her good hand. Halfway across, a flock of crows, disturbed by their passage, erupted from the girders above, their harsh caws echoing in the silence. Elias flinched, his heart leaping into his throat. Lena let out a small, stifled cry. Just birds. But in this world, even the mundane could feel like a harbinger of doom. They reached the other side, their feet landing on the muddy bank with a sense of profound, if temporary, relief. Milltown lay ahead, a cluster of derelict buildings huddled along the river, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the desolation. It looked abandoned, lifeless. But looks, Elias knew, could be deceiving. As they approached the outskirts of the small, ruined town, the air grew heavy with the stench of decay, a sickly, sweet, cloying odor that made his stomach churn. He'd smelled it before. The smell of the infected. Lots of them. His hope, already a fragile, flickering flame, began to dwindle. The clinic, if it was still standing, was likely overrun. But they'd come this far. He had to check. He had to try. The first street they entered was a scene of utter devastation. Houses stood in ruins, their roofs caved in, their walls blackened by fire. Overturned cars rusted in the gutters, and everywhere the signs of a desperate, futile struggle, discarded weapons, bloodstains on the cracked pavement, the scattered, gnawed bones of the dead. Lena clutched his arm, her knuckles white. He could feel her trembling. He put his good arm around her, a gesture of comfort that felt woefully inadequate in the face of such overwhelming horror. And then they saw them. Infected. Dozens of them, milling in the town square, a grotesque, shambling horde, their milky eyes vacant, their bodies bloated and decaying, their guttural moans a symphony of the damned. They were trapped. Again. Milltown wasn't a refuge. It was a graveyard, and they had just walked willingly into its gaping maw. Day 4. The descent was accelerating, pulling them down into a darkness from which there seemed to be no escape. The thin thread of hope he'd clung to was unraveling, strand by painful strand. The sight of the infected horde in Milltown Square was a physical blow, knocking the last vestiges of hope from Elias. He instinctively pulled Lena back, flattening themselves against the crumbling wall of a burnt-out shop. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of despair. There were too many. Far too many. The clinic was on the other side of that square, an impossible distance. "We can't," Lena whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "We can't go through there." He knew she was right. To attempt it would be suicide. But the alternative? What was the alternative? To turn back, to face the riverbank jackals again, or worse, the endless, infected, choked city? There were no good options left, only varying degrees of damnation. He scanned their surroundings, his mind racing, desperately searching for a way out, a loophole in this tightening noose of fate. The street they were on was a narrow, debris-choked canyon. Behind them, the way they'd come, was likely cut off by now. The infected, while not intelligent, had a horrifying, relentless instinct for fresh prey. To their left, a narrow alleyway, dark and uninviting, but potentially a path away from the square. It was a gamble. The alley could be a dead end, a trap. But it was the only gamble they had. "This way," he hissed, grabbing Lena's good arm and pulling her towards the alley. "Stay low and quiet." They slipped into the narrow passage, the stench of decay and damp refuse assaulting their nostrils. The alley was a claustrophobic tunnel of crumbling brick and overflowing bins. Rats scurried in the shadows, their tiny claws skittering on the broken pavement. Elias moved slowly, cautiously, the machete held ready, his ears straining for any sound, any hint of danger. Lena followed, her small frame pressed close behind him, the hunting knife clutched tight. The alley twisted and turned, a confusing labyrinth. Several times they reached dead ends, forcing them to backtrack, their frustration and fear mounting with each wasted moment. And then, they heard it. A low, gurgling moan, coming from around the next bend. Infected. In the alley. Blocking their path. Elias froze, his blood running cold. They were trapped. Again. He could hear it moving, shuffling, its grotesque wet sounds drawing closer. He exchanged a desperate, silent glance with Lena. There was no room to fight here, no room to maneuver. This was a killing box. He tensed, ready to make a last, futile stand. But then, Lena did something unexpected. She reached into the backpack, the one he carried, the one with their meager supplies, and pulled out one of the strips of jerky Samuel had given them. Before Elias could ask what she was doing, she tossed it. The jerky sailed through the air, landing with a soft thud on the pavement a few feet beyond the bend. The shuffling stopped. A moment of silence. Then, a series of eager guttural grunts, followed by the sound of wet, tearing flesh. The infected was distracted. Eating. Now, Lena whispered, her eyes blazing with a desperate, cunning light. She didn't wait for his reply. She darted forward past the bend, silent and swift. Elias, stunned by her audacity, her quick thinking, followed. He risked a glance as he passed. The infected was hunched over the jerky, its back to them, completely absorbed in its gruesome meal. They didn't look back. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the narrow alley, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and a wild, improbable hope. They burst out of the alley onto another street, this one wider, but just as derelict and deserted. The sounds of the horde in the square were fainter here, but still a menacing undercurrent. They'd bought themselves a temporary reprieve thanks to Lena's quick wits and a piece of dried meat. But they were still in Milltown, still surrounded, still in mortal danger. Elias looked at Lena, a new respect dawning in his weary eyes. This kid. She was more than just resilient. She was a survivor, in the truest, most brutal sense of the word. She was learning the horrific rules of this new world, and she was learning them fast. They found temporary shelter in the husk of a collapsed bookstore, its shelves bare, its floor littered with the decaying, rain-soaked remains of books. It wasn't much, but it was out of sight. They huddled in a dark corner, trying to catch their breath, trying to think. The clinic was out. Milltown was a death trap. They had to get out of this town, put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horde. But how? And where would they go? The questions hung in the stale, dusty air, heavy and unanswerable. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows through the broken windows, a new sound reached them. Not the moans of the infected, but something else. Music. Faint, distorted, but undeniably music, coming from somewhere deeper in the ruined town. Elias exchanged a wary glance with Lena. Music? In a world like this? It was a lure. It had to be, or was it a sign? A sign that somewhere amidst this desolation there were other survivors. Other humans? The thought was both tantalizing and terrifying. Day 5. The descent had led them into a new, uncertain landscape, a place of eerie silences and strange, unsettling sounds. The hope for medical supplies had turned to ash, but a new, more dangerous, more ambiguous hope had flickered to life. Or was it just another illusion, another mirage in this endless, unforgiving desert of despair? He didn't know. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they couldn't stay here. They had to follow the music. They had to know. The sound of the music, a tinny, distorted melody that seemed to mock the surrounding desolation, drew them deeper into the ruined heart of Milltown. Elias moved with extreme caution, the machete held low, his senses stretched to their breaking point. Lena, her face a mixture of fear and a strange, almost morbid curiosity, stayed close, her hunting knife a small, deadly extension of her good hand. The music seemed to be coming from a large, surprisingly intact building a few blocks ahead, an old vaudeville theater, its grand, decaying facade a ghostly reminder of a bygone era. Faded posters, depicting smiling, long-dead performers, clung precariously to its grimy walls. It was an unlikely beacon in this landscape of death and despair. As they drew closer, Elias noticed lights flickering in the upper windows of the theater. Not candlelight, but the brighter, steadier glow of electric lights. Electricity? Here? In a world where the power grid had collapsed days ago? It didn't make sense. Unless someone had a generator. Someone who was organized. Someone who was prepared. The thought sent a shiver of unease down his spine. Organized could mean safety. Or it could mean a more sophisticated, more dangerous kind of threat. They reached the theater's entrance, its heavy, ornate doors surprisingly intact, though scarred and battered. The music was louder here, a jaunty, incongruous tune that seemed to be playing on an old, scratchy phonograph. Elias hesitated, his hand on the tarnished brass door handle. This could be a trap, a lure for desperate survivors. But the alternative, to turn back into the infected, choked streets, was no longer an option. They were too deep in. He exchanged a silent, questioning glance with Lena. She met his gaze, her young face pale but resolute. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. They were in this together. He pushed the door open. It creaked, a loud, protesting groan that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The music stopped. Abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. Elias's heart leaped into his throat. He stepped inside, Lena a shadow at his heels, their eyes straining to adjust to the dim, cavernous interior. The theater's lobby was vast, its once plush carpets now tattered and stained, its ornate chandeliers dark and dusty. And it was empty. Or so it seemed. "Hello?" Elias called out, his voice sounding small and lost in the echoing space. "Is anyone here?" Silence. Then, a voice, smooth and cultured, startlingly out of place in this ruined world, replied from the shadows of a grand staircase leading to the upper levels. "Welcome, travelers. We've been expecting you." Figures emerged from the darkness, half a dozen of them, dressed in clean, well-maintained clothes, their faces surprisingly unmarred by the horrors of the outbreak. And they were armed. Not with makeshift weapons, but with rifles, held with a practiced, disciplined ease. Elias's blood ran cold. This wasn't a refuge. This was something else, something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The leader, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and cold, intelligent eyes, stepped forward, a faint, unnerving smile playing on his lips. "Do come in. Don't be alarmed. You're among friends here." Friends. The word sounded like a vile obscenity in this man's mouth. Elias didn't believe him, not for a second. He tightened his grip on the machete, his gaze darting around, assessing the situation, looking for an escape route. But there was none. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. Lena pressed closer to him, her small body trembling. He could feel her fear, a cold, palpable thing. He put his good arm protectively around her. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The silver-haired man's smile widened. "We are the fortunate few, my friend, the ones who were prepared, the ones who will rebuild. And you have the privilege of being our guests. Guests, or prisoners." Elias knew which one it was. They were ushered, not unkindly, but with an undeniable undercurrent of menace, deeper into the theater, towards a large, ornate doorway that led, Elias presumed, to the main auditorium. The air grew heavy with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something sweet and cloying like incense. It was a strange, unsettling contrast to the stench of death and decay that permeated the world outside. As they passed through the doorway, Elias's breath caught in his throat. The auditorium was a scene of bizarre, almost surreal order. The seats were filled with people, dozens of them, men, women, children, all dressed in clean clothes, all silent, all staring straight ahead, their faces pale and emotionless, their eyes wide and vacant, like the eyes of dolls. And on the stage, under a single harsh spotlight, stood a figure. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her face hidden by a porcelain mask. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, like a statue or a sacrificial offering. Elias's skin crawled. This wasn't a community of survivors. This was a cult. A bizarre, unnerving pocket of madness in a world already consumed by it. The silver-haired man led them to the front row, gesturing for them to sit. Elias hesitated, but the pressure of the armed guards behind them was a silent, compelling argument. He sat, pulling Lena down beside him. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, broken only by the faint rhythmic hum of what Elias now realized was a generator. Then, the woman on the stage moved. She raised her arms, slowly, gracefully, and she began to speak. Her voice, amplified by some unseen microphone, filled the theater, a soft, melodic, almost hypnotic sound. She spoke of a new beginning, of a world cleansed by fire, of a chosen few who would inherit this purified earth. She spoke of a great awakening. Elias listened, a growing sense of dread coiling in his stomach. This was a new kind of horror, not the mindless, animalistic violence of the infected, but a cold, calculated, insidious madness. A madness that was perhaps even more dangerous. Day 6. They had found other survivors. But they had not found sanctuary. They had stumbled into the heart of a new, terrifying darkness. And the descent, Elias knew, was far from over. It was plunging them into depths he could not have imagined, depths from which there might be no return. The woman in the white gown on stage, her voice a silken, hypnotic river, continued her sermon of a cleansed world and a new dawn. Elias listened, a cold dread seeping into his bones. This wasn't just a cult, it was a carefully constructed illusion, a fragile bubble of sanity, or insanity, in a world gone mad. And he and Lena were now trapped inside it. He risked a glance at Lena. She was staring at the masked woman, her young face a mixture of confusion and a dawning, horrified understanding. She was smart, this kid. She knew, just as he did, that they were in terrible danger. The sermon ended, and the doll-like congregation rose, as one, and began to file out of the auditorium, their movements slow and strangely synchronized, their vacant eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. It was like watching an army of the Walking Dead, but these were not infected. They were something else, something perhaps even more disturbing, humans stripped of their will, their individuality. The silver-haired man, who introduced himself as Marcus, the shepherd of this flock, approached them, his smile still fixed, still unnerving. "You see," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Order, harmony, a new beginning. Isn't it beautiful?" Elias didn't answer. He just stared at Marcus, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of this gilded cage. "You'll join us, of course," Marcus continued, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "You'll become part of our new world. You'll find peace here, safety." Safety. The word was a bitter irony. Elias knew there was no safety here, only a different kind of damnation. He had to find a way to escape, to get Lena out of this place before they too became empty-eyed dolls in Marcus's bizarre puppet show. Their quarters were a small, surprisingly clean room backstage, its single window barred, its door locked from the outside. They were prisoners, no matter how politely Marcus phrased it. Lena's arm was throbbing, and Elias's shoulder was a constant burning ache. They had no weapons, no supplies, no hope of rescue. They were alone, at the mercy of a madman and his brainwashed followers. "What are we going to do?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with a fear that was all too real. Elias looked at her small, fragile frame, at the courage that still flickered in her haunted eyes. He had to be strong for her. He had to find a way. "We're going to get out of here," he said, his voice low and determined, though he had no idea how. "We just need to wait for an opportunity, and when it comes, we take it." The opportunity, or what seemed like one, came later that night. The theater, usually humming with a strange, unsettling quiet, was filled with a new sound, A commotion, shouts, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Elias and Lena exchanged a startled, hopeful glance. Something was happening. Something that wasn't part of Marcus's carefully orchestrated illusion. The lock on their door clicked, and the door swung open. Not Marcus, not one of his guards, but a young woman, her face pale and desperate, a rifle clutched in her trembling hands. "Come on," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously down the corridor. "We don't have much time." "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his hand instinctively going to his wounded shoulder. "No time for questions," the woman said, her voice urgent. "Marcus, he's gone too far. Some of us, we can't take it anymore. We're getting out, and we're taking whoever wants to come with us." It was a desperate, improbable chance, but it was their only chance. Elias looked at Lena. She nodded, her eyes shining with a renewed spark of hope. They followed the young woman through the labyrinthine backstage corridors, the sounds of the commotion growing louder, closer. Gunfire echoed in the distance. Screams. The theater was in chaos. They reached a side exit, its door ajar, leading out into a dark, narrow alleyway. The young woman gestured for them to go. "Good luck," she whispered, her face a mixture of fear and a grim, desperate resolve. "You'll need it." They didn't look back. They ran, bursting out of the alley into the cool night air, the sounds of the imploding cult fading behind them. They were free. But free to do what? To face the horrors of Milltown again? The infected horde? They had no weapons, no supplies, no plan. They were just two wounded, exhausted survivors, adrift in a sea of chaos and despair. As they stumbled through the derelict streets, the first faint rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Day 7, the final day of their descent. Or was it? Had they reached the bottom? Or was there still further to fall? Elias didn't know. He only knew that they were alive, and that, in this new, brutal world, was a victory in itself. A small, fragile, terrifying victory. They had to keep moving. They had to find a way. They had to survive. The rest was just a prayer in the darkness. The dawn of Day 7 was a pale, indifferent smear across a sky still choked with the smoke of distant fires. Milltown was a cacophony of chaos behind them, the sounds of the imploding cult, gunfire, screams, the roar of flames, a fitting soundtrack to their desperate escape. Elias and Lena didn't look back. They ran, driven by a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the madness of the theater. Lena, despite her injured arm and the exhaustion that etched deep lines on her young face, ran with a grim, silent determination. Her resilience was a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. Elias, his own body a symphony of pain, his shoulder a throbbing agony, his ribs a burning fire, focused on her, drawing a strange, unexpected strength from her quiet courage. They had to find weapons, supplies, a defensible place. The thoughts ran on a desperate loop in his mind. They were vulnerable, exposed, prey in a world teeming with predators, both human and infected. They stumbled upon a small, surprisingly intact hardware store on the outskirts of Milltown, its windows shattered, its door hanging precariously on one hinge. It was a long shot, but they had to try. Elias pushed the door open, the machete he'd taken from the cultist guard, a small victory in their escape, held ready. The store was dark, silent, filled with the smell of dust, rust, and something else. Something metallic and coppery. Blood. He tensed, his eyes scanning the shadowy aisles. Lena, her hunting knife a small, deadly gleam in the dim light, pressed close behind him. And then he saw it. A body. Slumped in a corner, near a display of gardening tools, not infected. Human. A man, his clothes torn, his face a mask of dried blood, a crude, makeshift spear lying beside him. He'd been dead for days. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not an immediate threat, just another grim reminder of this world's brutal mathematics. They searched the store, their movements quick, desperate. They found a few dusty cans of food, a first aid kit with some meager supplies, a couple of sturdy crowbars. And then, Lena found it, tucked away on a high shelf behind a stack of paint cans. A crossbow, old, a little rusty, but seemingly intact, and a handful of bolts. It wasn't a rifle, but it was a weapon, a ranged weapon, a small, precious sliver of hope. Lena's eyes lit up. She'd never handled a crossbow before, but Elias could see the determination in her gaze. She would learn. They both would. They had to. As they were about to leave, a sound from outside made them freeze. A low, rhythmic shuffling, coming closer. Infected. Lots of them. Drawn by their scent, their movement, their fragile, persistent life. They were trapped. Again. The store had a back exit, a narrow, grime-covered door leading to a small, enclosed yard. It was their only option. Elias kicked the door open, and they burst out into the gray morning light, the sounds of the infected horde already at the front of the store. The yard was a dead end, surrounded by a high brick wall, its surface slick with moss and decay. No escape. And then, Elias saw it, a rusted fire escape clinging precariously to the side of the adjoining building, leading up to the rooftops. It looked old, unstable, but it was a way out. A desperate, terrifying way out. "Up there," he yelled, pointing. They scrambled towards the fire escape, the sounds of the infected, their guttural moans, their clawing, tearing sounds, growing louder, closer, as they breached the front of the store. Elias went first, testing each rung, his heart pounding, his wounded shoulders screaming in protest. Lena followed, her injured arm making the climb a slow, agonizing ordeal. They were halfway up when the first infected burst into the yard below, its milky eyes fixing on them, its lipless mouth opening in a silent, hungry snarl. Then another, and another. They clawed at the base of the fire escape, their grotesque, bloated bodies a writhing mass of decaying flesh. Elias and Lena climbed faster now, driven by a primal, desperate terror. The fire escape groaned under their weight, its rusted metal shrieking in protest. Rungs bent, bolts strained. It wouldn't hold much longer. They reached the top, scrambling onto the flat, gravel-covered roof, just as the section of the fire escape below them tore away from the wall with a deafening crash, sending a shower of rust and debris, and a couple of climbing infected, tumbling into the yard below. They lay there, gasping on the rooftop, the city spreading out around them, a vast, silent panorama of decay and desolation. They were alive. Again. But for how long? The sun, a pale, indifferent orb, climbed higher in the sky, its light illuminating a world that had descended into hell. 7 days. 7 days of unrelenting horror, of desperate survival, of choices that had stripped away their innocence, their humanity, leaving behind only the raw, brutal instinct to live. Elias looked at Lena. Her face was smudged with dirt and blood, her clothes torn, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But in her eyes, he saw that same spark, that same stubborn, indomitable flicker of life. They were survivors, battered, bruised, traumatized, but survivors. The descent was over. Or perhaps it was just a new beginning. A beginning in a world where every sunrise was a miracle, every breath a victory, every shared glance a fragile, precious connection. He didn't know what lay ahead. He only knew that they would face it, together. And that in this new, terrible world was perhaps the only kind of hope that mattered. The only kind of hope that could keep the darkness at bay, if only for one more day. One more sunrise. The rooftop, their precarious sanctuary, offered a panoramic view of Milltown's corpse. Below, the infected still swarmed the yard, their frustrated moans, a dull, persistent thrum. Elias knew they couldn't stay here. The infected would linger, and eventually, other, more cunning predators, human ones, might be drawn by the signs of their passage. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a constellation of aches. Lena was already up, peering over the edge of the roof, the crossbow held with a new, if still awkward, familiarity. Her resilience was a constant, quiet marvel. "We need to find a way down," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Somewhere else. Somewhere. Safer. Safer." The word felt like a cruel joke. Was there anywhere safe left in this world? He doubted it. But they had to keep trying. To stop was to die. They scouted the rooftops, a treacherous, uneven landscape of gravel, tar, and decaying ventilation shafts. The adjoining buildings were a maze of different heights and crumbling facades. Finally, they found it, a sturdy-looking drain pipe running down the side of their building into a narrow, shadowed alleyway that seemed, for the moment, clear. It was a risky descent, but less so than facing the horde in the yard. Elias went first, testing the pipe's strength. It groaned, but held. He began the slow, painstaking climb down, his wounded shoulder protesting with every movement. Lena followed, her movement surprisingly agile despite her splinted arm. They reached the alley, their feet landing on the cracked pavement with a sense of profound relief. They were back on solid ground. For now. The alley led them away from the immediate vicinity of the hardware store, deeper into the labyrinthine streets of Milltown. They moved like ghosts, silent and wary, their senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible alarm. They needed a more permanent refuge, a place to rest, to heal, to plan. Elias remembered vague stories, rumors from his paramedic days, of old fallout shelters, relics of a forgotten war, hidden beneath some of the older city buildings. Most were probably flooded, collapsed, or already claimed by other desperate souls. But it was a sliver of a chance, a faint, desperate hope. He tried to recall the locations, his mind a fog of pain and exhaustion. There was one, an old municipal building, not far from the river, its foundations rumored to house a substantial shelter. It was a long, dangerous trek, across streets that were likely teeming with infected. But it was a goal, something to move towards, something to cling to. As they navigated the derelict streets, Lena, her eyes constantly scanning, suddenly tensed, pulling Elias back into a darkened doorway. "Look," she whispered, pointing. Across the street, huddled in the ruins of a collapsed storefront, were figures. Human. Not the vacant-eyed cultists from the theater, not the predatory jackals from the riverbank. These were different. A family, it looked like. A man, a woman, 2 small children. They were gaunt, ragged, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. But their eyes held a spark of humanity, of shared suffering. They were survivors. Like them. Elias hesitated. His first instinct, honed by days of brutal survival, was to avoid them. Other people meant complications, danger. But then he looked at Lena, at her small, pale face, at the flicker of something, recognition, empathy, in her eyes. And he remembered Samuel, the old man in the pumping station, his gruff, unexpected kindness. He remembered the young woman in the theater, her desperate courage. Not everyone in this new world was a monster. Some were just trying to survive. Just like them. He made a decision. A reckless, perhaps foolish decision. But one that felt, in the deepest, most exhausted corner of his soul, undeniably right. He stepped out of the doorway, his hands raised, palms open, the machete left deliberately at his side. "Hello," he called out, his voice low, non-threatening. The figures in the storefront froze, their eyes wide with fear. The man pushed the woman and children behind him, his hand going to a crude, sharpened piece of wood at his belt. "We don't want any trouble," Elias said, his voice calm, steady. We're just looking for a safe place." The man stared at him, his gaze suspicious, wary. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then, the woman peeked out from behind the man. Her eyes met Elias's, and in their depths, he saw not just fear, but a shared, aching humanity. A flicker of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their common plight. She whispered something to the man. He hesitated. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his makeshift weapon. The world was still a hellscape. Danger still lurked around every corner. But in that small, ruined storefront, amidst the desolation and despair, a tiny, fragile seed of something else had been planted. Not hope, perhaps. Hope was too extravagant a word for a world like this. But something akin to it. Connection. Community. The faintest, most improbable glimmer of a new beginning, forged in the crucible of shared suffering, in the ashes of a world that had died, and in the stubborn, indomitable refusal of the human spirit to be extinguished. The descent was over. The climb, long and arduous and uncertain, had just begun,